The day Idi Amin wanted to annex Western Kenya, the reign of Uganda's former president Idi Amin Dada is filled with tales of eccentric behavior, authoritarian policies, and international controversies. Among these is Amin's infamous 1976 claim to large swathes of Western Kenya, a demand that sparked intense diplomatic tensions between Kenya and Uganda. This dramatic territorial claim by Amin was motivated by both historical and economic factors, as he cited colonial boundary changes and the prosperity of the lands he sought. The dispute serves as a powerful reminder of the complex colonial legacy in East Africa and the challenges surrounding post-colonial border definitions, Amin's claim and its historical context. In February 1976, Idi Amin made a controversial declaration while inaugurating the Lotucheru self-help mobilization scheme in northern Uganda. He claimed that a significant portion of Western Kenya historically belonged to Uganda and that the British colonial powers had unjustly transferred these lands. His statement stirred immediate concern as he enumerated districts in Kenya that he argued were Ugandan territory, including Turkana, Bungoma, Busia, Kakamega, and Kisumu, extending his claim all the way to the Rift Valley and even close to Nairobi. Amin's rationale was based on colonial maps and treaties, which were often arbitrarily drawn with little regard for ethnic and cultural boundaries. Following the Berlin Conference of 1884, colonial powers divided Africa into spheres of influence, with Uganda and Kenya falling under British control. By 1902, British administrators had further partitioned these territories into provinces, some of which Amin claimed rightfully belonged to Uganda. Amin contended that the British had unfairly redistributed lands for political and economic reasons, thus depriving Uganda of fertile and resource-rich areas in Western Kenya. The economic motivation behind Amin's claims, beyond historical justifications, Amin's demand for Western Kenya was largely driven by the economic value of the lands he claimed. The districts he cited, including the fertile agricultural lands of the Rift Valley and regions surrounding Lake Victoria, were among the most productive areas in East Africa. Amin argued that these regions, rich in agricultural produce and natural resources, had been unfairly taken from Uganda, affecting the country's economic potential. He asserted that if these lands were returned to Uganda, it would greatly enhance the nation's wealth. Amin's expansionist rhetoric was clear when he suggested that God had intended these fertile lands for Uganda, implying that the colonial boundaries had disrupted this divine allocation. Despite his strong claims, Amin assured his neighbors that he was not seeking war but instead aimed to educate Ugandans on their historical and geographical heritage. He even ordered the publication of a pamphlet detailing Uganda's original borders. Urging all Ugandans to purchase it to become familiar with his claims, tensions with Kenya, and diplomatic pushback, Kenya's President Jomo Kenyatta responded swiftly and resolutely to Amin's provocative declarations. The Kenyan government threatened to block Ugandan imports through Mombasa, a move that would have severely impacted Uganda's economy, given its landlocked status. This diplomatic standoff highlighted the strategic importance of Kenyan ports to Uganda's trade, a vulnerability that ultimately forced Amin to back down. Despite backing down, Amin's rhetoric continued to be confrontational. He declared that if the people in these disputed areas were dissatisfied with Kenyan administration, they should be permitted to establish their own government, suggesting a secessionist approach. In Amin's view, his duty as commander-in-chief was to correct what he considered historical injustices made by British colonial authorities. His proposed operation to correct mistakes made by the Britons reflected his desire to reassert Ugandan sovereignty over its lost territories. The colonial roots of border disputes, Amin's claims were rooted in colonial history, particularly in boundary shifts orchestrated by British colonial officials. In the early 1900s, British administrators, notably Sir Harry Johnston, redrew borders to suit their administrative needs, often transferring territories between Kenya, Uganda, and Sudan without consulting the local populations. Amin cited agreements by colonial officials, such as the 1914 Order in Council, which transferred parts of Uganda to Sudan, and another in 1926 that ceded territories to Kenya. Amin's claims pointed out that Uganda's territory had once stretched beyond its current borders, covering parts of Sudan, including Juba and Torret, and extending into Kenya's fertile Rift Valley region. However, the 1964 Organization of African Unity (OAU) resolution, which called on African nations to respect colonial borders as they existed at independence, made any reassertion of historical claims complicated. Amin's views on Pan-Africanism and border fluidity. Although Amin's territorial demands may have seemed like a personal vendetta or a nationalistic ploy, he often framed them within the context of Pan-Africanism. He emphasized that before the European partition of Africa, borders had little meaning to Africans, and families often spanned what would later become national boundaries. Amin argued that colonialism disrupted these natural boundaries, creating artificial divisions that disregarded ethnic and cultural ties. Amin asserted that his aim was not to incite conflict but to educate Ugandans about their geographical history and colonial legacy. His rhetoric echoed broader Pan-African ideals, as he referenced the need for African nations to respect each other's sovereignty. Yet, he paradoxically used these ideals to justify his boundary claims, positioning himself as a defender of Uganda's lost territories. Other boundary disputes involving Uganda, Idi Amin's territorial ambitions weren't confined to Kenya alone. Uganda has historically experienced other boundary disputes with its neighbors. In 2005, Sudan claimed a 5-kilometer stretch along the customary boundary, asserting that Ugandan administrative structures had encroached upon Sudanese land. Similarly, tensions with the Democratic Republic of Congo (DRC) have arisen over areas like Rukwanzi Island on Lake Albert, especially after oil discoveries in the region raised the stakes. In 2007, a clash near Rukwanzi Island led to gunfire. Underscoring the intensity of these disputes and their potential to escalate the legacy of Amin's claims on regional stability, Amin's claims to Western Kenya left a lasting impact on regional relations and underscored the fragile nature of post-colonial borders in Africa. His efforts to reclaim Kenyan territory did not succeed, yet they amplified concerns about the arbitrary boundaries imposed by colonial powers and the tensions this could spark. Uganda and Kenya have since worked to maintain stable relations, even as disputes over boundaries and resource rights periodically emerge, such as the Mejingo Island controversy on Lake Victoria. The legacy of Amin's claims also illustrates the challenges African nations face in balancing historical grievances with modern-day diplomatic relations. While Amin's rhetoric was rooted in historical facts, his confrontational approach brought him into direct conflict with neighboring Kenya, placing Uganda in a precarious position both diplomatically and economically. Conclusion: lessons from Amin's territorial claims. Idi Amin's 1976 attempt to annex Western Kenya remains one of the more audacious chapters in East African history. His demands, though unsuccessful, highlighted the deeply rooted issues of colonial boundaries, resource distribution, and economic disparities in the region. Amin's rhetoric and actions underscored the need for African nations to address these colonial legacies thoughtfully, balancing historical rights with contemporary geopolitical realities. In today's interconnected East African community, EAC, regional cooperation and conflict resolution mechanisms are critical to preventing similar disputes. While Amin may have viewed his claims as a correction of historical wrongs, his confrontational methods ultimately threatened Uganda's stability and regional harmony. The standoff between Uganda and Kenya in 1976 offers a valuable lesson on the importance of diplomacy, respect for national sovereignty, and the need for peaceful negotiation over historical grievances.